minute and a couple seconds.
Okay.
So you are being recorded. So if you have any issues with being recorded, this is the time to leave. We'll be posting this on our YouTube channel, so you can go back and watch it again later. First, we'd like to say welcome. Thank you, John, for coming today and doing this presentation for us. And we hope to see everybody at the 4C conference, August 18th through 20th at the Hilton downtown Austin. And with that, I will turn it over to John. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Gina, and I appreciate the opportunity to kind of present an overview of NSPS QQQ. And I realize some of the folks that we have on the call know QQQ very well. So there may be times that you want to ask questions. This is an overview. It's not super in-depth, as many of you know, especially when you get into determining applicability, particularly historical applicability. It can get very complex. So I'm going to kind of skim over some of those areas, but still kind of present what they're all about. So again, thanks for taking the time to join. And again, NSPS QQQ for refineries. And I'm going to highlight the fact that this is a VOC suppression rule, and I'll have a few things to say about that during this presentation. Let's see, get my screen to work. Did it change on your end, everyone?
No, I can't see your slideshow yet.
Oh, you can't. I thought I had it up.
Yeah, I think you unshared your screen.
I am going to share again. How about now? There we go. All right. Sorry about that. And thanks. I'm glad I did that. So the first one, of course, is a caveat. What I'm presenting here is based on my many years of experience working in the oil and gas and refining industries in the environmental regulation area. But however, if you find yourself in a situation where you need, and this is given by a technical person, if you find yourself in need of legal support and legal interpretation, of course, consult a licensed attorney in your state. I am not one and would not want anybody to think otherwise. So background on QQQ. This regulates new, modified, and reconstructed affected facilities at a petroleum refinery. This thing was promulgated back in 1987. It was almost the day I graduated from undergrad. Basically, NSPS works by regulating VOC emissions from individual drain systems, otherwise known or typically referred to as sewer systems in a refinery, oil water separators, broadly defined, and I'll get into that in a moment, and an aggregate facility, which is kind of a term of art that is descriptive of the individual drain system and oil water separator combination, and I'll kind of explain that in a moment. The rule is designed to suppress VOC emissions from refinery, oil water, sewer, and wastewater treatment plant. And I say suppress versus the word control, and you may hear me kind of accidentally use those interchangeably, but understand one thing, that it is not absolutely about VOC control in the same sense as many of us in the air world think of control, particularly when you consider the benzene waste NESHAP rules. And when you use the word control there, it means something a bit different than VOC suppression in QQQ. I'll explain a bit more on that in a little while. The concept, I just explained VOCs, but basically it's to suppress and minimizing VOCs to the atmosphere in the sewer system and oil water separator systems by the use of water trap seals in sewer systems, tightly sealed covers on manholes and junction boxes of the sewer system, though vents are allowed with certain design specifications, and I'll get into that in a bit. covers on oil water separators or other means of suppressing VOCs that are coming from oil water separators and ancillary equipment associated with oil water separators, and enclosed piping for any recovered oil. So if it's not in what you would normally think of as an underground sewer system, if it's above ground lines and the such that are carrying processed wastewater and oils from from a refining process unit, those too need to be enclosed. The QQQ affected IDS. I just want to kind of explain. These are the actual definitions in the rules themselves. An individual drain system includes a process drains connected to the first common downstream junction box, and I've got a diagram of that. It includes drains and common junction box together with associated sewer lines and other junction boxes down to the receiving oil water separator. I'll explain that in a moment. And then also the oil water separator means the wastewater treatment equipment used to separate the oil from the water, consisting of separation tank and a whole lot of other stuff, including separator basins, skimmers, weirs, grit chambers, sludge hoppers. All of that stuff is included in the definition of an oil water separator within this rule. And it makes a difference. I'll kind of get into the nuances of what that can mean at your facility. This diagram here just kind of is a quick diagram of what an individual drain system can look like. In the upper left-hand corner, it's drains that are associated with a unit, and they're associated downstream junction boxes all the way down to the first oil water separator. In this case, there's an oil water separator associated with this sewer system and with this particular refinery unit. And in this case, this is the individual drain system and as an effective facility, and the oil water separator can be an effective facility. On the bottom and in the middle, another individual drain system is noted, and with a hash line drawn around it, and it goes all the way down to, in this case, a secondary oil water separator or the main oil water separator associated with the refinery. And in this kind of within the dotted lines of the oil water separator on the right of your screen is all of the other associated ancillary equipment that are also included in the definition of an oil water separator. So I'm just kind of laying this all out there, and it kind of comes into play when you look at applicability with this rule in a bit. And it looks like somebody's waiting in the lobby too, Gina, if you can let them in. The QQQ affected aggregate facility, this is an individual drain system together with the ancillary equipment, oil water separators, including the secondary oil water separator as applicable. This is sort of I have even a hard time explaining how this works, but basically it is called an affected facility when certain modifications or construction changes are made. And what it can do is trigger the QQQ VOC emission suppression controls for the entire individual drain system all the way down to and including the secondary oil water separator system. Many refineries to this date have already triggered affected or the aggregate facility for as an affected facility because of course it's been 35 years or so since this rule was promulgated. And the way NSPS works is that it doesn't automatically mean that something that you have already had built has to come up to certain standards. But if you change, modify, I'll get into this in a moment, change things to the point that to a certain level, essentially, again, I'll get into it, it is requiring you then to ensure that you have controls on the rest of the older pieces of equipment. So that's why the term triggering is used. It basically says you now have to bring everything else up to standards. It's not unlike the ADA rules. If you have a building that doesn't meet Americans with Disability Act and you do a significant amount of changes to that building, it's pretty typical that if you do that, then you are also triggering the fact that now you have to bring it up to a certain standard. That's an analogy that many people are familiar with, and that's true in many things in a refinery. So this is just a description of what the aggregate facility is. It's both the individual drain system, including all of the associated junction boxes and the oil water separator, a secondary oil water separator. So what is construction? I had mentioned if you change some modification or construction, you can trigger QQQ. Well, construction means the fabrication, erection, or installation of an affected facility. So for NSPS QQQ, an existing facility includes the components of an oil water sewer that meet the definition of an individual drain system, oil water separator, or the aggregate facility prior to the change. Reconstruction means the replacement of components of an existing facility to such an extent that the fixed capital cost of the new components exceeds 50% of the fixed capital cost that would be required to construct a comparable, entirely new facility. So this essentially is saying that if you reconstruct it, you're going to be triggering QQQ and you have to bring it all up to standards. There's also this argument if it's technologically or economically feasible to meet the applicable standard set in the rule. I've never seen anybody argue that it's not technologically or economically feasible to meet the control requirements of the rule. And I would think that that would be a difficult argument to make because refineries all over the country have been doing this for many years, even prior to this rule making you do it. So what is modification? A modification means the physical or operational change to an existing facility that results in the increase in the emission rate to the atmosphere of any of the pollutant that's involved, in this case, VOC. So the emission rate increase can be evaluated through emission factors. So if you do some things that increase the emission, then you may be triggering a modification and triggering QQQ applicability. And I'll get into a couple of examples of how that can happen. So there are some exempted operations that I want to make sure people are aware of and get into the nuances later in this call or elsewhere. But segregated stormwater sewers are exempted. I'll get into kind of why stormwater that's separated from the oil water sewer is separated by a water seal or completely separated sewer system. And when I mean by segregated stormwater sewer system is a stormwater system or even a stormwater drain or a stormwater individual drain system. It may be connected to the refinery wastewater collection system. However, if it is connected in a manner that doesn't allow downstream VOC emissions to migrate essentially upstream and through the stormwater system, then it is segregated from a VOC standpoint and doesn't trigger QQQ controls. A couple of other things that are also ancillary equipment that's physically separated from the wastewater system and does not come in contact with or store oily wastewater. That's sort of sort of given, it's sort of like, hey, this stuff doesn't even though it looks like a sewer system, if it has nothing to do with a processed oily wastewater or doesn't have VOCs associated with it, QQQ does not apply. So water softening operations separated by a water trap, non-contact cooling water systems could be an example. Sometimes non-contact cooling water systems are collected in non-contact cooling water sewer, what they look like a sewer, but they're drain systems and they look almost like identical to a sewer system, but they take the water elsewhere, not to the wastewater treatment plant. Those kinds of systems are excluded from this rule as well. Another exclusion to kind of point out that some people often don't really understand is, and this is where two rules are designed not to interfere with each other. I had mentioned earlier about the oil water separator and how inclusive the definition is, and it can include ancillary equipment, oil storage tanks, grit chamber, forebay, a lot of stuff. But if you have tanks that are associated with the oil water separator system, and those tanks are also regulated under tank regulations of K, KA, or KB, they are actually excluded from the QQQ regulation. It's a line right in the regulation. So provided those regulations apply, then you can exclude them from QQQ. It just keeps it from those tanks being regulated by two differing regulations. So modification exclusions, another exclusion I kind of wanted to roll out there. A modification does not occur if there is not an emission increase. So in this case, if, for example, you wanted to add a new drain to an individual drain system that may have some VOCs associated with it, you can modify that individual drain system by adding that drain. But if you remove an equivalent or more of the emissions that you added to it, then you meet a couple of other capital cost criteria, you can do this without triggering what's known as a modification, and therefore not triggering QQQ. So in modifications that occur without a capital expenditure are also excluded. So think of repairs. For refineries, and a capital expenditure is 7% or more of the effective facility on a cost basis, so the original installed cost. But do note that this exclusion cannot be used if a new individual drain system is constructed. It's specifically in the rule that you can't do that. So anytime you put in a new individual drain system, you absolutely trigger QQQ for that individual drain system that you installed, and that's the drains and the associated junction boxes downstream. And an individual drain system also does include by definition, the first junction box. So that's sometimes, I'm not going to get deep into that, but that's sometimes many people don't quite understand that. And I have to admit, every time I look at individual drain systems and triggering QQQ or not triggering QQQ, it can get very complex very quickly, especially if the records are not real good about when some of these things were initially installed. So in many cases, it takes a number of people studying and understanding not only QQQ, but the construction history to find out whether or not something should have or did not trigger QQQ. As a matter of fact, I have some slides here that I'm going to skip through quickly, or skip over here because we only have a certain amount of time to go through that. But I just wanted to kind of emphasize that it can get very complex very quickly, depending on the history. So I'm going to skip ahead, knowing I was going to do this, to control requirements, just to give folks an understanding of what it actually means. Once you do trigger QQQ, these are the kinds of things that the control requirements that the rule requires on all these pieces of affected, on the affected facilities. So individual drain system controls, they require in active process drains, water seals or equivalent. There's some applicability determinations of how you can apply some other equivalent kinds of technologies that that act the same as a water seal. Caps and plugs on inactive drains. Junction boxes that have tight seals around the edges of the covers. So think of a manhole. You can't have a manhole on top of it with holes in the manhole or the manhole cover or junction box cover. They need to either be plugged or put a solid one on it. They also need to have a gasket and a seal around them. And I'll get into inspection, but it needs to have this. They need to have a tight seal. Though interestingly, and I'll show you some examples of this, the junction boxes can have a vent as well, constructed and designed a certain way, and I'll explain that in a bit. But that's one of the reasons I kind of emphasized VOC emission suppression, because you can still have some areas where some VOC can be released from a sewer system under QQQ VOC suppression standards. Sewer lines that also cannot be open to the atmosphere. So you can't have a ditch, for example, or some other kind of clay tile or something along those lines that is a drain system for or part of an individual drain system that is open to the atmosphere. That those have to be enclosed such that no gaps, cracks, or other openings where VOCs can be emitted to the atmosphere. Some examples of individual drains and how controls work. On the left hand of the screen is, this came from an EPA document about how drains, how sewer systems, this is a cross section of looking at a sewer. So think of the water going through the page. If you've got something draining into this, into basically an open pipe, and any VOCs associated with the water and oil in the sewer, if VOCs can come up and be released in the, I think hopefully you can see my pointer, through the screen and coming out of this ancillary room, then that would not be compliant with QQQ. What QQQ requires is that if you drain something into the sewer or into the drain, that VOCs associated with whatever is in the sewer cannot bubble back up and come back out. So if there's a P leg or a P trap in here, that is preventing VOCs from coming back up out of the sewer system into the atmosphere. This is no different than your home drains in your home sewer system, or in your sink at home, or in your bathroom, or your toilet, or any of that. All of your home stuff is designed this way as well, and that's to keep sewer gases from being able to come back up through your drains and into your house. The only way water can be drained through these P-traps is the fact that this is vented somewhere else. And in your home, that's vented typically one or two spots. The sewer system in your home is vented out through a straight pipe up, usually through your roof. And that allows for water to be able to go in and displace the air that's in there, and that air goes back up out of the vent. I'll show you an example of that in a junction box here in a moment as well. But that's the whole point of a water trap seal. And what QQQ says is that you have to have that or something equivalent in the drains to control VOCs at a refinery. And a lot of refineries were constructed this way, but there are also quite a few examples, especially refineries that were, built at the turn of the 20th century, not the 21st, that were not designed that way, or they're just a hodgepodge of sewer systems that were changed and modified or reconstructed. And I don't mean to use those words as defined by this rule, but just messed with over a century or at least decades, where those kinds of things were not necessarily always part of design criteria, especially in the days where emitting VOCs wasn't a pollution issue that it is now today. Or it was, but it wasn't at least regulated. The last one on the right is just another way to get oily wastewater into a drain, and that is just to do it directly into a sewer without any kind of way for it to be any gases to be released from the atmosphere. EPA calls this a closed drain, the other one a P leg or a P-trap drain. Another way that some refineries over the last 30 years have, if they've triggered QQQ, for example, they've gone back and modified some drains to put in a water seal trap by putting an insert in a drain right at the drain itself. And this can be done, and sometimes not for a whole lot of money. It just allows somebody to drain process oily wastewater into a drain, but it has to first go through a constructed by this insert water seal. Water would come in here, go underneath, and go back over. So it basically is acting like a P-trap. So you can actually look these things up on the internet and buy them from certain areas, or certain manufacturers will design and construct them specifically for your application. Here's another example, or an example of a junction box that I was talking about earlier. Oily processed water can come from the left here, come into this junction box. Most of them are constructed such that they go into a junction box and they are turned down, creating an invert and actually creating a water seal right in the junction box itself. And the outlet, once water comes in, it fills it up and the water will go out to the right. But this actually creates a water seal. In many cases, this is designed both in the refining industry, but also just in municipal sewer systems as well. This keeps gases from going from one junction box to another. So imagine if this went on to another junction box that was constructed like this. And the reason for that, both in the municipal areas and manufacturing, and especially in refining, is the fact that you don't have an open conduit of VOCs from one junction box to another. This isn't always the case, but I'm saying it's typically, at least nowadays, certainly designed this way. And the main reason for that is fire protection. Because if you get a spark and something explodes downstream here, you want to do everything you can to keep it from migrating or igniting gases that can easily be in the explosive range in these sewer systems in one area. And if they're all connected by some kind of open headspace, then you can just have an explosion that goes boom, boom, oh, that goes boom, 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 all the way through a sewer system. And there have been historic examples of that. Very old refineries may or may not have been designed to do that. And in some cases, that can be a dangerous situation if it's not known or understood the risks involved there. The other thing I wanted to point out from this diagram too, I mentioned earlier about a vent. QQQ, well, first of all, it doesn't require this downward water trap seal. But the reason I wanted to bring this up was the fire protection purposes. It keeps headspaces from being connected. But just as importantly, if this was a segregated stormwater system and the only water coming through this pipe is relatively clean precipitation, for example, and it doesn't have any associated oily water, then, and maybe even another line is coming in here in the same junction box that does have oily water associated with it, at least this line is segregated from the oily water with a water seal control by this turning down. Therefore, the stormwater drains associated with this would not have to meet QQQ VOC control standards. But you need to be able to demonstrate that and actually have records of this kind of thing. I'll get into that in a moment, but just kind of keep that in mind when you think of the exclusion or exemption of segregated stormwater sewers. Now, back to the other interesting thing about this particular slide is that I mentioned vents. If there is processed oily wastewater in this junction box, you still can have a vent. The vent is needed one way or the other, whether it vents this direction or vents to the atmosphere or vents to a control device. A vent, in many cases, is needed so that as water comes in here, you're displacing the air with the water, and that air needs to go someplace. QQQ allows you to vent it to the atmosphere, but the vent has to meet certain design criteria, and that design criteria is that vent has to be at least 4 feet tall, I believe. I'm just off the top of my head, and cannot be larger than 4 inches in diameter. That's just to help minimize the amount of VOCs that's coming off of it. I need to cook along here. Other oil water separator controls, or that oil water separator controls I want to talk about. Fixed roofs are required and must be vented to a control device on an oil water separator. So either carbon, flare, oxidizer, or some other kind of control device. Typically, that's because there's quite a bit of VOCs associated with the oily water in an oil water separator. There's an alternative standard too. You can have a floating roof on the liquid itself in an oil water separator. But any areas that don't have a floating roof that's minimizing the amount of VOCs because of the floating roof, those areas can have a fixed roof, but they need to be also purged to a control device. And I'll get into that in a moment. So associated oil water separator tank controls, slop oil tanks, slop storage tanks, storage vessels, all part of the oil water separator. They need to have fixed roofs to a control device, or as I said earlier, these tanks need to meet acceptable equivalent standards for storage vessels under K, KA, or KB. Control device standards. So I talked about this. Combustion devices must be designed and operated to meet 95% VOC reduction. with a minimum residence time of 3/4 of a second at a minimum temperature of 1500 degrees Fahrenheit. You can also have vapor recovery systems, for example, carbon adsorption devices. Carbon canisters certainly can be used. And then also flares can also be used, provided that they're meeting the requirements of flaring regulations. Closed vent systems. I mentioned this is an interesting thing. If you have a fixed roof and it's going to a control device, this is one of the only areas within QQQ where kind of an enhanced level of inspection is required. The closed vent system must be perched directly to the control device, and a flow indicator must be installed as well to ensure that what you are designing to go to the control device is indeed going to the control device. There's not a lot of definition around what a flow indicator is in the regulation. I've seen folks using a pressure differential to show that flow must be going in a certain direction, or sight glass, or even something as simple as ribbons in a sight glass to show that yes, indeed, the flow of air or flow of emissions is towards the control device and not going out somewhere else, some hole or a gap, crack, or other situation that might be otherwise going to the atmosphere. So I want to get into monitoring, record keeping, and reporting requirements. So water trap drains. So those require monthly visual inspection of active drains for low water levels. They also require a repair within 24 hours or put them on a delay of repair. I'll explain that in a moment. Weekly visual inspection of out of active service drains for low water levels. So those are drains that aren't actively getting any kind of liquid to them. In those cases, the regulation actually requires you to inspect them more often than monthly. The refineries that I've seen do these inspections, however, just to cover it all and just to make it easy, they just kind of basically inspect all the drains weekly. Just make it part of a weekly round. That way you're not kind of trying to figure out, well, which one's monthly, which one's weekly, and that kind of thing. Just making them all and inspecting that and inspecting them that way. The other thing, again, these need to be repaired within 24 hours or delay of repair if you can't do it within that time frame. Again, I'll explain that in a moment. Junction box cover seals, they require a semi-annual visual inspection to assure that they have a tight seal around the edge. If they don't, and there's a problem associated with them, they need to be repaired within 15 days. Same with unburied sewer lines, wastewater and slop lines, as well as semi-annual inspections of and looking at these for indications of cracks, gaps, or other problems that can cause VOCs to get to the atmosphere. Again, repaired within 15 days. Oil water separator inspections. Well, the fixed roof covers that I talked about earlier, they require semi-annual visual inspection of roof and access doors. Again, repaired within 15 days. Floating roof covers, they have, we'll get into it here, but those also, they need to be inspected every 5 years for the primary seal and secondary seal gap measurements annually. So that has to happen. And semi-annual visual inspections of access doors and other openings. So all of those things need to be inspected and assured that they're meeting the requirements of the rule. Again, tanks under K, KA, KB, if they're part of the oil water separator system, they've been excluded, but make sure you're still inspecting them as required by the tank regulations of K, KA, and KB. So control devices and closed vent system monitoring. I had mentioned this earlier, but in closed combustion devices, must be monitored for 95% VOC reduction, flare monitoring, and even if you're using carbon, 95% VOC reduction efficiency. And in non-regenerable carbon adsorber, which is the only type that I've ever run across, breakthrough monitoring is required. It's either daily or at least 20% of the design life of the carbon in the particular place that it's being used. And so that's also a requirement. Closed vent system, using method 21. This is one of the only places where method 21 is actually required in the regulation. Semi-annual monitoring to make sure that you don't have any leaks that are above 500 parts per million. Again, that's on the closed vent system. That would be on a fixed roof cover, for example, that's going to a control device. So that does require method 21 inspections. Record keeping. Oh, we're doing good on time. So the location and date of visual inspections that identify breaches and problems and their corrective actions. Examples: water added to water trap drains, capped or plugged drains not in place, junction boxes without tightly sealed covers, oil water separators, all of that stuff. Location of out of service or inactive drains. Note, though, I wanted to explain here, though I'm not advocating this, but if you ever in a situation where somebody is asking for all of the inspections, the rule doesn't actually require you to have written records of all of the inspections. They just require you to do them all. The only thing that's required by the regulation to have records of is when you have a problem. So you record that you inspected, that you had a problem, and that you fixed it within the time frame that it's required. That is required in the regulation. That said, I certainly suggest to keep records of all inspections anyway. It's just easier. That's your own way of proving and having your own assurances that all the inspections were done as you know they should be. And it all depends on how you keep these kinds of records. It can be done with paper. It can be done with paper and combined with other kinds of handheld devices. Many people satisfy a lot of these QQQ requirements because they are also subject to B1, at least for many parts of it. And if a facility or parts of the facility are also subject to benzene waste NESHAP, then satisfying benzene waste NESHAP will also satisfy QQQ. That is often done as well. Record keeping continues. So the location date of NDE measurements for the closed vent system, including background levels, maximum levels, breaches as matter, as you could imagine, and corrective actions that are required in a unit shutdown that use the delay of repair provisions. I told you I would come back to this. So delay of repair is allowed if, for example, you cannot make the repair without a unit shutdown. There's not too many cases in QQQ where that's the case. Most of the time, in my experience, most of the repairs that need to happen, like sealing up a junction box cover because it had a hole in it or something like that, can be done without a unit shutdown, and therefore delay of repair would not be allowed or advised. But there might be some cases where there's a drain under a unit and you just can't get to it or do the repairs safely. If that's the case, then all of that information needs to be recorded, especially the expected date of when the repair can happen, the reason for the delay, and even the signature of the decision maker to delay that repair. And make sure you're keeping records of that. Record keeping monitoring data for control devices. So all 3 hour periods of deviations for continuous monitoring devices and dates and times of carbon breakthrough for non-regenerable carbon breakthrough adsorption systems. So again, keeping records of all of that. Design specifications for QQQ systems, including exclusions for segregated stormwater system, ancillary equipment, and non-contact cooling water systems if applicable. So you need to keep all of this stuff, and you need to keep it readily available, I believe is what the regulation says. dates and the startups and shutdowns of closed vent systems and control equipment. And generally, data must be maintained for 2 years, except for this design data and some of the exclusions that I had pointed out earlier. You need to keep that information for the life of the facility. And then lastly, some reporting requirements. Because it's in SPS, under general requirements for NSPS, anytime construction is commenced, you have to notify. You have to notify the date of the startup of NSPS. Then in QQQ specific requires after 60 days of the initial startup, you have to, the equipment to use to meet the standard has to be installed and initial inspections have to be completed, and you certify that it was installed and the inspections and all things are working the way they were supposed to be. That has to be, that reporting has to be done. And then lastly, semi-annual reporting of all the visual inspections that were done, breaches, and then also reporting on any breaches that were found and the associated corrective actions, and control device monitoring deviation results as well, as applicable. And then also, again, back to notification of delay of repair if used, including the date of the next refinery turnaround and the reason for the delay is necessary. Wow, I've been speaking fast and a lot. I've got just a few more minutes. If I can help answer any questions or comments for anybody, I would be happy to do so. Do we have any?
John, I think Deaver had a question. He had asked him, you want to just ask it, Deaver?
I was back to slide 15. John, you had the 7% trigger for the modification for of the original affected facility, and I've seen that. I've seen that IRS guideline, asset repair guideline, but I don't see it in the definition of 60.14, and I didn't see it in QQQ. So I wanted to maybe talk about that a little bit. I didn't know if that was built more into the example that you sort of skipped over in the slides after that to get to the next section.
It was a little bit, and I have to admit that I'm still a bit fuzzy on that. Every time I go through this,
I am too. I was just hoping you were less fuzzy. So.
Well, what exactly is your question? And maybe I can answer it, or maybe I can't. But of course, I'm happy to follow up with you on that. Is your question, where does the 7% come from, or the use of doing this?
Well, I've used it in the past, the way distant past, on an LDAR project, but within those rules, VVVA, there's actually there's a modification formula, so the 7% really doesn't come into play. But I've also used it, but I've seen the 7% used both for LDAR and for QQQ, and so I was sort of wondering what the origin story was on it, and if I was missing a reference to it.
Yeah, I can't answer that exactly, at least not off, especially since we're being recorded too. I wouldn't want to be wrong.
Sure.
So for that reason, I can do some more digging, but but it's a good question, and I appreciate it. I do know that it's just sort of a standard as well that I have grown up to know and use, and then every time I do, I have to go back and assure myself of that. But I will also admit that it rarely comes up anymore, because it's been a long time, right, since this rule was promulgated. And about the only time it seems to come up is when there's some kind of dispute about whether or not QQQ is actually applicable or not. And in a couple of cases that I have been associated with over the past few years, instead, it has turned out that instead of trying to answer that in every specific situation and some consent decree negotiations that I have been associated with, it was just simply easier to stipulate to QQQ being applicable going forward when there was some kind of dispute, and just say, look, it's been too hard to figure out, but what the refinery ended up doing was just stipulating to complying with it, and then making some changes, and everybody kind of walked away not as unhappy as they were going into the negotiation.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Well, we can talk about it again at some point, but I'm just sort of curious about the 7%. So
yeah, it feels like I've looked that up before, but it's been too long to come off the top of my head with an answer for you. Yep.
Sure.
Good. Any other questions? You, Mark, anybody? I think a couple more folks joined as well. I can't see who is on and who's not, so I'm just looking at my screen. Actually, I think I can stop sharing. There we go.
No questions from me.
Does that?
Bo, do you have any questions?
Me?
Bo.
Can I play guitar for anybody? That's what I'd rather be doing. But
We would love that, John. Go for it.
no. Come to one of my gigs here in Naperville. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to join John's webinar.
Oh, and I see, I'm sorry, I see Bo is on here. Thanks, Bo, for joining. And Mikkel, I don't think I know you, but thanks for joining. I appreciate it. Sorry.
Oh, no, I just wanted to thank everybody. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, John, for the webinar. You guys have a wonderful day.
Great. Thank you, Gina.